All right. So yeah, thank you all for coming tonight to listen to me talk. I am okay if you interrupt me, if you have questions, you can ask them. My hope tonight is kind of just talk to you about what I see in my work with these boys and manifesting girl carriers. Um, I will be the first one to tell you that I definitely don't know all the things. I'm talking mostly anecdotally from my clinical experience and what I'm finding is working. And my hope is that I can kind of give you guys a bunch of information from my end, and then we can, when we come back together, we can have hopefully a rich conversation, more specific to what you guys deal with and what are the bigger things in your life. So I always feel like it helps to kind of have an understanding of how somebody thinks prior to kind of drinking all their Kool-Aid, so to say. So I am a radical behaviorist in how I think. And so when I am talking about behavior, I'm talking about thoughts, feelings, and physiological responses at a biological and physiological level. And in this world, I'm always kind of operating in overt and covert behavior. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because there's important distinction in why I'm talking about this will be relevant in a minute. And so we have overt behaviors, the stuff we can see, right? This is how behavior manifests. We only have so many ways as humans that we can respond behaviorally. And so we tend to have a lot of behaviors that mean similar things, right? Versus covert, we can't see these things. These are our biological processes. This is how our brain operates. This is how our body, our cells perceive the world and react to things happening around us, and then influence how we learn, think, behave in any given situation. And then all of this, right? Then we have how humans are unique. And I think about that in the context of punishment and reinforcement sensitivities. And so if you are somebody that loves attention, then you might be a class clown, and people are going to say like, oh, you're a class clown. If you hate social attention, you might be somebody that's shy or reserved or socially anxious. The process of receiving social attention and that feeling of having attention isn't really different for people. How they feel about it, like I like that feeling, I don't like that feeling, is then changes how people interact with that, right? So if you like that feeling, you're going to want more of it. If you don't, you're going to want less of it, right? If you love adrenaline, you might want to jump out of airplanes. If you hate it, you might be like, I'll read a book and not jump out of an airplane. Thank you very much. But adrenaline isn't different for people, right? And so it's really about how you tolerate that as an individual. So that always plays a role, even when I'm talking about our boys with and manifesting girl carriers. That's important. And the reason I talk about overt and covert behavior is because we always want to make sure that we're talking about function, because function is more important to understand than topography. So topography is what behavior looks like. This is how behavior can manifest, right? So crying is an overt behavior. So if you can cry when you're happy, you can cry when you're sad, you can cry when you're excited, you can cry when you're startled, you can cry when you're in pain. If we assume every time you're crying, you're always sad, we are going to miss out on opportunities to know when you're happy, to know when you're in pain, to know when you're. So we want to understand the function of crying, not just the topographical behavior of crying. And this is really important because when it comes to mental health and behavior in our boys, we tend to do this we tend to not do well with this in a way, because we're like, oh, they're hyperactive, so they have to have ADHD. Well, what we're learning is there's actually a lot that's going on in the brain for these boys and manifesting girl carriers that maybe doesn't make sense from an ADHD framework. And maybe those treatments maybe aren't the best bet. And so we want to focus on function, because this is where I think we're not doing a great job for our boys and manifesting girl carriers. And in this way, then diagnostic labels are not always helpful. They're helpful in the sense of getting resources. We need those, right? Not always helpful in the sense of like knowing what to do about it. And so this can be problematic because even, you come see somebody like me in, Columbus, Ohio, and I'm going to say like, oh, I wouldn't call it that, but let's call it that so we can bill it so you can get help. But if I send you somewhere and they see ADHD, they're not even going to think of Duchenne at that point, right? Because they're like, oh, I'm treating ADHD. But they're not separate things. And so we really need to start to understand our boys and manifesting girl carriers in the context of them, and not in the context of how we understand standalone mental health disorders and conditions, right? Because we're trying to lump them into these groups that we know exist based on what we're seeing behaviorally. But that can have so many different functions that the functions are probably very different when you have Duchenne and when you don't have Duchenne and you're presenting as hyperactive. So in this way, a lot of the, yeah.
I mean, how often does that happen in your experience? Have you seen that happen?
What? Say that again.
How often have you seen that happen? Is it quite a common thing?
Which part?
That people come to you or to your department and they're presenting with the behavioural, before Duchenne is diagnosed?
Rarely. I mean, we diagnose pretty young, and most of the behavioral manifestations of how they tend to be impacted neurocognitively seem to start to be more problematic as like 3 or 4, and usually a lot of our kiddos are diagnosed by then, or working through a diagnosis by then. We're working on that and getting better at how do we better catch this based on sort of behavioral phenotypes, and that's one of the things we're working on from a genetic level and genetic contributors, because there are some really unique similarities across our boys in manifesting growth carriers, but there's some very big unique differences, and so we're trying to make sense of that to help kind of guide, because we do see some of that. We're just not, I'm not confident to say like this constellation kind of groups here and this groups here, not yet anyway. So hopefully, but I don't see a lot of that in my clinic anyway. Good question though. So the behaviors we do see often, the behaviors most reported to me in clinic when I'm seeing kids in our MDA clinic, are the ones on this board. And so whenever I see a family in any situation, and now all I kind of work with is Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy, and neuromuscular conditions, and some other things, genetic, complex, weird stuff. But anytime I'm seeing a family and I'm seeing this litany of list of stuff, right? Like, we got a lot going on, right? And so depending on who you see first and how you describe it, right, they're gonna be like, oh, that's autism, or that's ADHD, or that's OCD, or that's anxiety. And it could be that, right? They could have a piece of that. But I just am one of those people, like, I don't think that these kids are the most unlucky kids in the world. Like, I don't think they have Duchenne or Becker and then also like 4 standalone mental health conditions. I just don't think that they're that unlucky. I definitely think that there is a neurocognitive piece to dystrophy that we don't really understand, that is really impacting their brain, and that's what we're seeing. And so my hope from today is that I can kind of leave you with an understanding of maybe why your kids do some of the things they do that are challenging, and maybe some strategies to better manage that. But I'll be the first one to tell you, like, we are never aiming for 0 or perfect. We're aiming for reducing frequency, intensity, duration, and our recovery time, because at the end of the day, Duchenne, Becker's is a neurocognitive condition as well. And we're working on changing that understanding in the community in general, because that's a big piece, and that some of these things are just really hard and impossible for these kids to do at certain times in development. And so, well, one of the things that I see a lot is dysregulation. So when we're talking about emotional dysregulation or physiological dysregulation, we're talking kind of about an issue within an autonomic nervous system. And this is a system that sort of that controls autonomic, sort of involuntarily body functions, movements in the smooth muscles and glands. And there's 2 systems here. Our sympathetic system, this is our fight or flight response. This is our mobilizing system, gets us going, dominant during periods of stress. It kind of is what tells us if there's a tiger in the corner. This is the system that's like, tells my brain like, oh, you better do something about this. There's a tiger behind you. When you have a threat stimulus response, your hormones are released. There's hormones released in the bloodstream that increase respiration, heart rate, and blood pressure, and decrease the process of elimination, digestion. So those two processes, right, increasing respiration, heart rate, and blood pressure, are want to avoid with our boys, because cardiomyopathy and our manifesting growth carriers because of that. But then they also do tend to have slower gut motility and these other things that we also don't want to exacerbate, right? So there's medical benefits to managing stress differently as well for these kids. Parasympathetic system is the opposite. It's our shutdown system. This is our energy conserving system. These 2 systems function in homeostasis to keep us balanced all day. And they work usually outside of our conscious awareness, right? So you're thinking, you're going to have a physiological response that is stimulating, right? You're going to release glutamate, you're going to release sort of neurotransmitters that get your brain moving. And then when you're sitting, you're calming, your parasympathetic system is shutting that down. And they work and then they shut, and they just kind of do it all day. And this is important when it comes to attentional control, because to learn, right, and to learn to pay attention. So attention is important because you can't learn if you're not able to sustain attention. And attention is trained. And if you have a lot of processes, right, that delay your frontal lobe maturation, which it does seem these kids kind of have, kind of couple-year delay, but then also, right, those processes are needed for you to actually develop the regulation skills that your peers of the same age, you're already at like a disadvantage. And so, and then the second piece of that is when you're aroused, highly aroused often, your learning is not optimized. So we have to be aroused enough that we can learn. But if we're too aroused, right, our learning is actually negatively impacted. And so then if you're a kid like one of these kids that's like kind of chronically up there, it's a double whammy from learning how to actually self-manage yourself, right? So they're always kind of chasing developmentally to like help their body feel okay, right? And this can be stressing. So I do a lot of biofeedback work, which is using computer equipment to kind of look at physiological stress responses in the body, as well as sort of breathing patterns and muscle responses and different sort of biochemical things like that, that I use a lot with my kids when I'm working on helping them understand their bodies. And the reason I started doing this is because when I first started working with these kids, I was like, I'm an evidence-based psychologist. This seems totally doable. We're really good at this. I'm going to teach these kids relaxation strategies. We're going to teach them deep breathe. It's going to be great. And that made everything way worse. And so that was weird. And what I started realizing is when I was doing these deep breathing things with these boys and these relaxation strategies, it was actually exacerbating a lot of their physiological distress. So then I stopped and I went back and I learned a whole bunch about Duchenne. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm an idiot. Of course. Their muscles are impacted and when you're deep breathing, your diaphragm's impacted and your inspiration, expiration muscles are impacted, your chest muscles are impacted, your chest cavity muscles. And our diaphragm, why we teach deep breathing, right, is because when we're deep breathing, you're stimulating that diaphragm, the vagus nerve runs over the diaphragm, you're kind of activating that, and that's the nerve bundle that kind of can help get that parasympathetic system activated a little bit more than it would. So it kind of helps facilitate a shutdown, right? So that's why, we train you to, if you've ever had a panic attack or you're anxious, you've probably learned how to do deep breathing and notice that does help reduce your physiological arousal, right? If you can get good at it. So I started hooking these kids up to this equipment to kind of see what was going on because I wasn't sure what to do about it. I wasn't sure how to help them. And so that's what I'm gonna talk about here for the next little bit about what I see. So all of us kind of do this all day. So unless you're a female mom carrier, which I'm happy to talk about, I don't talk about in this talk, but I talk about in others, but I'm happy to talk about how that plays out because that's a real thing too.
Yes, please, that'd be brilliant. Thank you.
Say that again?
Yes, please, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to. So a normal physiological pattern throughout the day would look kind of like this. Like you're going up, you're going down, your body's regulating itself. It's in the middle of your distress tolerance window, as I would call this window, this box around these lines. So things that make your box really big, like getting good sleep, having support, getting adequate nutrition, not being chronically ill, not being in a stressful environment like a war zone, not having trauma. Things that make your window smaller, the opposite of those, right? So we want to do things that optimize and keep our window really big so that we always have room to build, right? Because if our windows get small, then we're automatically quickly out of our window that we can tolerate, our body can tolerate that amount of physiological distress. So if any of you have a trauma history, if any of you have panic attacks, what this is akin to is those instances where out of the blue, all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I'm having a panic attack, or I'm having a moment of like trauma re-experience, and it floods. And what you've probably learned in therapy is that isn't actually out of the blue. It's a slow, insidious process over the day. And then boom, you hit your limit and now you're flooded, right? You're overflowing. Same process for these boys in a lot of ways. So I'm not an anxious person, but I'm a hyperactive and energetic person, as my mom kindly says. And so when I walk to work, and if I'm walking to work and I almost get hit by a car, I might have a physiological reactivity response like this, okay? I'm going to feel that because it's kind of getting to the top of my window. So I might notice I get hot. I might notice my heart race. I might notice like I have, butterflies in my stomach, my hands get cold, and a physiological anxiety response. I'm probably like, watch where you're going. And I get mad, right? And then I calm quick because I'm not anxious. My body isn't going to sustain that, right? My body has not learned to live that high. So it's going to shut down really quick. What I see when I've hooked up every single child with Duchenne or Becker muscular dystrophy or who's a carrier, what I see it, and I have not seen this. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm sure there are kids out there that don't have this pattern, but this is everybody I've ever seen. When I hook these kids up, I see this. And so this process for our children is incredibly stressful to the body. And I think there's two reasons why we see this sort of insidious, slow, kind of wavy increase throughout the day without a formal shutdown. And so it's not that their body can't shut down, it's that for some reason they're not sustaining shutdown, right? So they're continuous escalating, which is that brain piece. And then for some reason, when our body wants to shut down, it's kind of kicked back up. And I have an idea about why this is, which I'll talk about next. But this process over time, right, when you're living up here, is just very stressful. Like it's just very stressful on your vascular system. It's stressful on your GI system. It's stressful on your muscles. It's stressful on your mind. It's stressful on sleep. It has secondary effects. And so you can habituate to living here, right? And you won't even notice it because humans are really, really adaptive creatures to our demise. Even sometimes we're adaptive. And so many of our kids are living in a very, very heightened window. And I think, based on what I see, that why we see this pattern is that there's something that goes on in the brain that really creates sort of this inability to ignore, suppress, or sort of habituate from like a brain reactivity standpoint to stimulus. So they're kind of always bombarded, they're always taking stimulus, and their brains are always being activated, and their neurosynaptic spaces are always firing, even when they shouldn't, right? So their brains are kind of hijacked in a sense, right? It's kind of, they're very overwhelmed. And so they develop these chronic sort of overactivity of the sympathetic system. They become very reactive, right? Their bodies react quick, and then they can stay there because they learn to function at a high level. That doesn't mean that's good for them. It just means humans are adaptive and we can function in places we shouldn't, right? Which is how people can survive in Antarctica or in space, right? Because we can do that. Then you have the impact of muscles. And what I think happens is when I hook these kids up and I look at their patterns of breathing, they all have this very choppy style of chest breathing, even though they're not anxious, right? It's like an anxious style of chest breathing, but they're not anxious. A lot of these kids are just feel like, I'm not worried about these things, right? And I think that interrupts their ability to sustain parasympathetic activation. And so it's not that these systems don't work, right? They just don't work as well as they should. And so when you're a kid, right, and you're in school and like your brain's hijacked and it's like, and then you can calm, but you're trying to calm, but it gets interrupted, right? Like that can quickly become a very exhausting process and a hard thing to kind of maintain and manage, or at home for that reason. And over time, they kind of develop this like chronic physiological pattern, it seems, where their windows get very small and they start to actually have like startle responses or physiological sensitivities, physiological reactions that are louder than they should be to neutral stimulus and positive stimulus. And so they start to misinterpret threats. And that's what happens when your brain is in a heightened state of fight or flight. And we see that in people with a lot of trauma too. And so what happens is you can quickly find yourself in a situation where your brain is now hyper primed and treating everything as a potential threat, even though cognitively you don't feel threatened and you don't even realize that you feel threatened, right? And you get used to that. So you're like, oh, I feel okay, right? But physiologically, your body's going crazy. And then this kind of creates a behavioral phenotype for our kids. And this is in addition to them being individuals, right? They have their own punishment and reinforcement sensitivities, right? There are kids that actually literally like that adrenaline. Some of our kids love it, and they have a less of an issue with some of these things. A lot of our kids don't tolerate it well, and they have a harder time managing these internal processes. And then we put them on steroids, and that's going to amp up everything, right? And so it really is like a perfect storm for these kids to have challenging behaviors. Fun fact, my moms who are carriers and manifesting carriers at that, they have a very similar physiological pattern to the boys. And sometimes I'll hook them both up to different machines at the same time and just watch them like escalate each other. And so, you think about putting your kid down to bed if you're a carrier and you're like, this thing always goes bad and I'm trying to keep calm. But even if you're calm here and your body isn't, right? Like if you've ever been around somebody you care about a lot and they're like, oh, I'm fine, but they're not, right? Like you can try to mask it all you want, but your kids are going to feel that and they're going to feed off you. And we know that exists outside of Duchenne because there's really, really strong literature on kids and moms and physiological sensitivity to each other. And so sometimes I'll just put them on dad's lap, hook them up, and the kid's like calm as can be, or you throw them on top of their, their service dog or something, and they map right onto the dog because these kids are sensitive, they're mappers. So if you're a manifesting carrier mom and you're like, I don't know, I'm like struggling right now, and then your kids have more problems, like you might be a factor to that. Not saying you're doing anything wrong, right? But these kids are sensitive to stimulus around them and environmental and physiological stimulus, and we as humans are stimulus properties, okay? And so living here, less than ideal, right? Stressful, we're out of our window, and it takes a long time to recover. And so when I talk about these things with my families and how I want to start to look at these issues, right, specific to our kids, are kids with Duchenne Becker, not kids that don't have Duchenne Becker. Like, keep your labels. But if we start to think about how we see these things play out, what we start to notice is this box: learning, difficulties with attentional control, inability to suppress extraneous background noises, troubles with information processing. These are kind of neurocognitive manifestations of your brain being hijacked, of living chronically elevated. There's a separate Duchenne process, right? But secondary to that, even if you didn't have Duchenne or dystrophy, and you live that heightened because you had that much trauma, we would expect to see some of these neurocognitive impacts. So there's the impact of Duchenne, and there's the impact of how Duchenne impacts the brain chronically, which then secondarily impacts it how it does originally. Does that make sense? So these boys are and manifesting girls are like triple whammied a lot with like how they're trying to regulate and why it's hard for them to feel calm sometimes, or to calm down when they're very upset.
Is it like a negative feedback situation, Natalie, almost? Is that what it is?
Yeah, it becomes a negative closed feedback loop. Exactly. Exactly. These in this purple box, these would be behavioral manifestations, right? So this is how we see it play out behaviorally, right? When you're really aroused, or your brain is kind of over hijacked or overstimulated, right? You have less distress tolerance for stimulating event, like harsh noises. You can't tolerate those things as much. You have a hard time transitioning. We're all like that. Like, if you've ever been really stressed, going through it, maybe your job transition or something like that, and like you clean your house, and you're like, I just need this space to be like this, and then someone comes home and they're like, move stuff, and you come home, you're like, holy Moses, I'm gonna lose my mind. Who touched my stuff and moved it around, right? And it's not a big deal. It's just, it's an environment, and you felt away in it, and now the environment feels different. Sometimes you might be like, I don't know who messed with my stuff in here, but I just know something's different, right? And that's because when you're really stressed or you're heightened, you're really sensitive to those types of things, right? So sometimes our boys start to like order in a line, and we'll talk about that. Hyperactivity, rage-like meltdowns. Selective mutism is one we actually see quite often. And if you think about fight, flight, or freeze, selective mutism is a freeze response. So sometimes these kids get overwhelmed and they just stop talking. They just like won't engage with you anymore, right? Same process. And what we find is if we treat selective mutism, we make it worse, right? Because how do we treat selective mutism? Through exposure and through doing things that make you more activated, right? But if we treat arousal, sometimes we can just get the selective mutism to go away without even treating it. Right? Same with like ADHD. So I'm a big advocate for like, let's understand our kids as our kids and not in the context of other mental health conditions. These bottom ones, hyperfocus, kind of fits in both boxes, so I put it in both. Perseveration, so this is like, where are we going to grandma's? When are we going to grandma's? When are we going to grandma's? When are we going to grandma's? Question, the same question over and over. And then the OCD like behavior, like they're ordering, they're aligning. Sometimes they can have some cleanliness ones, but it tends to be more around their personal environment. Like, I like things a particular way. I like my pants need to be very specific. And so those are kind of like maladaptive coping strategies, right? So if we start to think about things like this, right, where we're like, okay, well, maybe we don't have to assign 1,000 labels. And these are actually treatable in a lot of ways. Like, we can treat a lot of these things and help slow you down. And then we throw in sleep. And there's something really wonky about how a lot of these kids sleep, and we're not really sure about that. But we're working on some studies right now that will help elucidate that, hopefully. But there is definitely some things that probably are interrupted from a good sleep process in dystrophies that we just don't have a good sense of right now. But if you don't sleep, and kids who are chronically don't get good sleep and who are sleep deprived present very similarly to kids with chronic hyperarousal, trauma, and or dystrophies. So these kids with these sort of hyperactive brains or kind of hijacked brains tend to present similarly, even if it's just because you don't sleep, right? We can see this. And our boys maybe don't, and manifesting growth carriers, maybe don't sleep that well for some reason, right? They maybe don't go into good sleep because of how dystrophin is affecting their brain's at a cellular level ability to actually get good sleep. And that's not their fault, but that's going to definitely make everything worse, right? And so challenging. And so when we're, unfortunately, as society is structured, the way that we tend to parent, not bad, it's not wrong, and it works for most kids, right? If your kid is doing something, you're like, okay, I can kind of let that thing slide. It's not a big deal. And then you wait till they kind of get to a certain thing. You're like, okay, seriously, if you do that again, you're done. I'm taking your tablet. I'm done. That would work, right? Like, they're like, oh, I don't want to be in trouble. Okay, right? And they kind of like get it together. But for these boys, when we do that, what we do is we actually further exacerbate their response, because that's a threat. like we're threatening them. I'm going to take this away. I'm going to do that. And not that it's a scary threat, right? But it's a threat nonetheless. And when your brain is hijacked, right? Any such threat, anything that could kick that up, if you're already high, is probably going to take you out of that window, right? And now we're kind of in this space for writing this. And this becomes problematic for our kids because we tend to want to intervene places like here, like when we start to see it, we're like, I'm serious, you got to stop. And like here, right? And then like here. And at this point, right, once we're past a certain place, anything we do is going to make it worse. And if you've ever noticed like your kids like melting down or something like that, and you're like whispering and you're like, hey buddy, you got to calm down, you know, like what's going on? And they're like, why is everybody yelling at me? That happens a lot. Things are louder, right, when you're heightened. And so at that point, sometimes the less is more, right? Like just fully disengage, lower your voice, quiet, put them in the room for 10 feet, like however long they need to calm, because anything that you do is now just new stimulus input into that little hijack brain. And so we don't want to intervene here for these kids. Not that intervening here for non kids without dystrophy is great, do that. But for these kids, it actually works a lot better to intervene here. And the reason why we do this here is because unlike other kids, that if they do get aroused, right, during the day, their body will naturally shut down because it can't sustain that level of arousal for that long. And they don't have a muscular reason to not have that parasympathetic activation system be sufficient and be maintained. So we intervene here because we want to shut down these, we want to shut down to a lower level because we know they're going to build back up, and then we shut them down again. And we take this process intentionally throughout the day because we know that it's not happening on its own. And if we don't intentionally shut it down, it's just going to continuously escalate. And so it's kind of a very similar way of parenting. It's just a little bit earlier in the chain than you would normally do, because we want to assume these kids are more heightened. And so for them to actually learn to self-regulate and learn these things, we have to intervene earlier to optimize where they're actually can learn, right? Because once they're all the way up here, it doesn't matter what you teach them and how great of a parent you are and how skilled you are at being like, okay, we can't hit our brother, we gotta do, they're not gonna, that learning isn't gonna take like it takes your other kids, okay? Because their brains are not optimized to learn in that moment. So what do we do? Good question. I'm going to talk about what has been working so far. So we want to focus on antecedent management. And so antecedent management is just really referring to staying ahead of behavioral meltdowns and staying ahead of things that trigger, activate our kids. So this is really focusing on the management of sensory and aversive stimulus, and as well as distressing internal states like hunger and competition. These kids do not do well with competition. If you're a parent of a kid with Duchenne or Becker and your kid does really well with competition, I am so excited to hear from you, because I have never met a family that's like, my kid does super great with competition. But you think about competing, right? That is a very activating experience. And then losing is a threat. And they do not handle losing well at all. And so we want to avoid those types of things. So even little things, okay, let's race to the kitchen, right, can have a really big impact on how these kids regulate. And it can be hard for them to kind of come down from that. So little things like in your home, if you notice, like, yeah, we like kind of sing, and then sometimes he just like loses it. And then we're like really off our game for hours after that. Chances are there's something about this really innocuous process that isn't a big deal for other kids that is really, really contributing to some of these processes in your kid. We want to focus, this allows us to kind of develop strategies that are more proactive than reactive. And most parenting, again, not bad, is reactive, right? Your kid does something, you're like, hey, don't do that thing, right? We're not staying ahead of it to be like, hey, you're about to do that thing, right? We catch them after the fact. Fine thing to do. Most kids learn like that because they're not over heightened. These kids don't learn. So then they need a bazillion more learning trials to learn things. And then we want to stay ahead of it because it also then keeps our window big. And so then if we do have a response, we still have room to move in there and then shut down so we're not out of our window, right? Because once we're out of our window, we're kind of riding that until we can just kind of naturally shut down. We do this because it increases our distress tolerance, so builds that window, which then reduces the likelihood that we will misperceive neutral and positive stimulus as potential threat stimulus. So when you're trying to talk to your kid and coach them in using a calming strategy, they're not going to feel like you're yelling at them. Also increases the time you have to intervene prior to a full meltdown, and it optimizes their ability to learn. which they need in order to develop self-regulation strategies. So in my work with these boys, most kids, you can start self-regulation strategies, get pretty good success between, I don't know, like 6, 7, 8, somewhere in there. I find for my boys and manifesting girl carriers often, although manifesting girl carriers tend to pick it up a little bit better earlier, they're usually not super good at this until like 8 to 10. So they do seem to have like a little bit delay in like brain maturation in a regulation standpoint. So then you think about how that plays out at school or with peers, where you're expected to be able to regulate and to manage this thing like a 7-year-old, but your brain may actually regulate like a 5-year-old, right? So that's a mismatch, right? That would be hard for a 5-year-old to be expected to regulate like a 7-year-old. We wouldn't do that, but we do that to these boys all the time at school. And so it's just like the world is not designed, like it's not designed for them. And if it was, right, they'd probably be thriving and like having conversations about us and like how needy we are and weird we are. And so, you know, context is important for maybe why we see some of these things play out how they do. And one of the best things I've done, and I feel silly every time I talk about this, but I'm telling you, like the one thing that I have parents do that they're like, this changed our life, is scheduled breaks, regardless of activity, 24/7, 365. And so if your kid is one of those kids that melts down or is like freezes or is like challenging or like hyper, or like hits you and they're mad and that kind of stuff, they're like more behaviorally chaotic. Schedule breaks may really help. And the reason why we do schedule breaks is because we're just assuming this physiological process of arousal is happening and we're just going to stay ahead of it and shut it down. I have some kids who need a break once a day. I have some kids that need a break only during certain transitions, like transitioning from lunch back to school in the afternoon, or a break after certain classes prior to other classes, or some kids like really need breaks after like music, right? Or those louder, sort of more stimulating classes at school, or the ones that have like less structure, right? Where they're just like, teachers are like, do whatever. Sometimes they need breaks after that. There are other kids who need breaks, robust breaks, right? Like I have kids who have such dysregulation that we truncate their school days. Like they'll go to school 3 hours, they'll take Wednesdays off. And lo and behold, right, they can tolerate being at school those 3 hours and they're not, you know, so chaotically dysregulated that they're trying to hurt themselves. And so everybody's different. You have to kind of play around with that. Most kids do well with a break every like hour and a half, 2 hours when they're younger, and then obviously need less as they age. And the one plug.
What kind of things are important to include in those breaks? So is it, you know, would you suggest food, or is it, you know, rest or reading? What works best?
Yeah, so in those periods of scheduled breaks, a low stimulus environment that doesn't have electronics, so it's not YouTube, it's not video games, coloring, reading, playing with Legos, stuff that's not competitive, listening to a soundtrack. A lot of kids they like the mood, so a lot of parents, when they make their break rooms for the kids or their break spaces, they'll put like a rocking chair in there or like one of those bounce seats so kids can kind of move but without tiring themselves out or pacing. Sometimes parents will just sit in there with them and do like breathing exercises and that kind of stuff, and it's just like their meditative time every 2 hours. But yeah, a low stim environment that's quieter, kind of removed, that lets them kind of take their space. And the reason you're doing that is because you want to relax their brain. So someplace where they're continuously receiving sensory information is less than ideal. Some kids do really well with smells, and so like they have like certain smells, and so you can like dip some aromatherapy on cotton balls and keep them in there, and they can like smell those while they're playing with stuff or different stuff like that, soundtracks, and be like, go listen to your 3 songs, and when your 3 songs are done, you can come back and stuff like that. That just can help provide that time for that parasympathetic system to kind of do its job, right? To like get a good shutdown in there.
That's really helpful actually, because I know lots of parents on here and carers will have full-time jobs, will have multiple children, will have this, this kind of thing is hard to implement, although it's really obviously so important to get there before the triggers kind of happen. But it's really helpful to have things that are easier for us as parents to actually use in a day.
Yeah.
So yeah, music is a really good idea. Thank you.
I encourage you to, take everything I say with a grain of salt, because it's all about like how it fits in your family and your system. And this is pie in the sky. Like nobody can do all these things, right? Like nobody can have like adhere to the stuff I'm recommending. But small changes in schedules and small changes in proactive planning and antecedent management can make huge differences. And this is important, schedule breaks, because all arousal is arousal. And so a common thing I hear from my families is like, we had a great day. You know, we woke up, we saw grandma, we went to the zoo, we got ice cream, and we came home and we were like, you know, getting ready for bed, and they just lost it. Well, all arousal is arousal, right? So if you had a great day, if you had a bad day, if you had a great day, you're like jazzed, and now all of a sudden we're going to transition. And these kids here, like, no, you can't stop a Ferrari going 150 miles an hour that fast. It's just not going to happen. And so all arousal is arousal. And so you want to stay ahead of it because you don't ever want to be there, right? Because then when you stop, now all that, they got all this energy and no party to go to. Okay, well, your house is about to become a party, and not a party that's fun or that you want to be a party, right? And they're just going to have to work that out. So that's why I say 365, 7 days a week. Doesn't matter if it's fun, not fun. It could be a funeral, anything. If they're on 2-hour breaks, they're on 2-hour breaks. And then after a few years of that, I find that usually once they're more mature, they don't need that kind of break schedule anymore. YouTube. Real quick plug about YouTube. So I don't know why or what happens, but I find some weird things happen when the boys watch YouTube for a very long time, particularly those kids that go down those rabbit holes where they're like watching a video and it leads to another weird video, it leads to another weird video, and it leads to another. Those kids have a really, really hard time disengaging and deregulating from YouTube. And so if your kid is the type of kid who's super dysregulated and they watch a lot of YouTube, one of the things that has been most helpful is truncate or like regulating that to like 30-minute increments, take a break, play, watch again for 30 minutes. And they can watch 8 hours a day. I don't care. I'm not the YouTube police. But the break in between there is important, because otherwise like they're just continuously kind of like overexciting their brain by these like new videos that are stimulating, and they can have a really, really hard time kind of shutting down from that. So that's the only plug I'll make about YouTube. So one of the ways that is helpful for getting some of these other things started is structured schedules, concrete behavioral expectations to establish predictability and consistency, because they just tolerate that better, because then the world is less like, oh, unpredictable. And when you're reactive, anything that you're just not expecting, it compounds, right? Like even if it's not a big deal. And so even small things like creating rituals for managing and responding to known triggers, like my kid struggles with transition. So we're going to have a ritual for transitions. And over time, doing that ritual will buffer the transition, right? Because their body is now primed and prepared to transition because you just did the ritual. And rituals and these things are important, right? Like we all have these, we just don't realize it. We all have ways of doing things that if you interrupt that, you're like, oh, I feel off. And so it can help kind of facilitate things that are harder normally by putting something ahead of it that isn't related to that, but then can help you ease into that. And the reason why we want to do this is because they do seem to need a lot more learning trials to develop mastery than other kids, which makes sense when you're very dysregulated, your brain is kind of flooded. You don't learn as well, so you do need more learning opportunities and trials. And so the kids that do best are the kids that like they might struggle with something for a while, but then their parents they do the same thing over and over, and the kid kind of gets used to it and they're able to do it. And that can take some time, and it can take more time than other kids, but that is something that can be really helpful for these kiddos. You want to maintain baseline expectations for behavior and consequences for misbehavior, regardless of whatever's going on, like a pandemic. When we change these things, we're sending the message that like something's going on, which therefore means we don't need to maintain our sense of normalcy. So kids cope better when things are just the way they always are, regardless of what's going on with them, because at least then it's like, oh, well, this is what we normally do. Things are okay. You think about just being at work, and if all of a sudden the normal processes of work change, you'd be like, well, what's going on? Like, do we need to worry? Are you like restructuring? You're going to fire me? Like, I'm nervous about this. And that's just because something in the daily routine of how we do our job changed, right? And you're going to notice that you have anxious thoughts about that. Skipped ahead. Incorporating schedules also then allows you to schedule times to actually start to develop child coping strategies. And so structured time can look like sitting down and doing specific exercises and like identifying emotional processes in the body, how your body feels, labeling emotions, developing words for these things so that they can communicate. We do tend to see a higher rate of expressive language delays in these kids. And so when you think about trying to communicate something abstract, like an emotional experience, right? Like most adults aren't good at that. Like most adults will be like, I'm so mad right now. And they're not, right? They're depressed or they're sad or they're in pain or somebody hurt their feelings, but anger is an activating emotion, right? Like you get angry and you're like, I'm going to do something about this. When you're depressed, it's like, it's not activating. So anger is a protective emotion, right? But anger probably, that's not really what the issue is for a lot of people. Same thing for kids. So like helping them have a lot more ability to discriminate what's going on for them is helpful, especially because they do need really particular practice in that because they're not really good at it at baseline. No kid is or person, but they're even worse at it. And then unstructured time could just be like that time where they're maybe taking their break and they're going and they're just like going to look at clouds, or they're going to go to their little space and relax and like think about ideas or color or build a Lego house or something like that. Or it could be like, we're going to work on strength-based messaging around how to talk about the situation, write me a short story or something like that, right? And then you're working on ways, hopefully fun, that are just providing more of that opportunity for them to develop this skill set that will be very helpful. Scheduled breathing practice is really important. I train and encourage a controlled rhythmic chest pattern of breathing versus a deep diaphragmatic, and every kid's kind of different, but what I would encourage you to do if you're somebody that's into this kind of stuff is kind of just watch how your kid breathes, and like you want to work on having them kind of map onto that, so they're quickly chest breathing, and then they're working to slow that down, right? So they're slowing down to help shut their body down. I don't see as robust effect as I would for people that we train deep breathing with, but I see a big enough effect that I encourage you to do it, and it will produce meaningful changes when they can get really good at it, particularly as they age, and you might see some posturing changes. I have a lot of my boys, not so many manifesting girl carriers yet, but a lot of my boys, as they start to lose ambulation, 12, 13, 14, and they're, posturing kind of weird. And what you'll see is these periods during the day, and their teacher's like, they're doing great. And then they just start to get like agitated easily. And what I noticed with some of my kids is, they're leaning, and I'll look, and their oxygenation is a little lower, right? Like they're perfusing in like the low 90s or mid 90s. And so what you do is, you train them that like lean your chair back, bud, like lay back, open up your lungs, right? And, lo and behold, oxygenation improves. They can kind of regulate their breathing and they can calm. And so sometimes it's about thinking like, if you're scrunched over in this and your position weird, like how is that going to impact how your body's responding physiologically? And it's probably going to be in a state of distress because it's not breathing as well, right? But they're not going to notice that. Nobody would notice that. And so it's these little tweaks and things that can make a huge difference for these kids. Sometimes if your kid's a worrier, sometimes you might have to put a limit on that. Like you can worry for 10 minutes, we're gonna set a timer. Okay, tell me your worries. And then I'm gonna ignore you the rest of the day. So they know that what's gonna happen. I'm not being mean. I'm gonna ignore you. So you can keep worrying, but I am not gonna talk to you about it. And we do that because unintentionally, when we reassure or when we provide a lot of support around that, we actually make it worse. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But that's okay, right? You can tell them, like, if you're gonna keep worrying, that's fine. You can write your little worries down. You can put them in a jar. You can tell me about them. I'm just not gonna talk to you about them. I'm not gonna respond to you, right? Because we already did our worry time and we can't worry all day. And you're doing this not to be mean, but to show them like, yeah, we can worry. And then we gotta move on and like live our life, right? Because we can't live in worry land, right? And you're modeling that through, gentle and through love and through like giving them the space with them being like, and now we're done with that. You want to avoid as best as possible punishment-based interventions. Not that they're not effective, right? Timeout, huge fan of timeout. I use timeout all the time. I try to avoid timeout with these boys when to my biggest degree, because it tends to not always make things better. Not that it's bad, it's a great training program. And spanking. So positive punishment, spanking, negative punishment would be timeout. So those two things can sometimes exacerbate behavior just because they're so sensitive reactive. And we want to reduce that contact. So one of the things I do recommend if you're a family that struggles with this more so is a token economy. And I'm not going to dive into that. I'm happy to do it next time, but I would be here talking to you for 5 hours about token economies because I love me some token economies. So I really strongly encourage that. And you can Google them, or if it's something you guys are interested in, I'm happy to talk about it more in the next talk. But they tend to be a lot more effective because it reduces the opportunity of taking things away because they're only accessed based on behavioral expectations, meaning behavioral expectations. So you're moving from this paradigm of you didn't do X or you did X, you hit your brother, so you're losing your tablet, you're losing your Xbox, you're losing this, to you didn't do X, Y, Z, you didn't earn it, right? So I'm not taking away from you. right? So that's a much less threatening place, and the kids tend to tolerate that a lot better. And then it lets you develop a monetary system. So if they want anything, you'd be like, okay, I got to do X, Y, Z, and you can like earn points to like do this thing. It just allows you to restructure how you engage with your kids. And then if you have kids without a dystrophy, it allows you to target specific things they're working on and keeping things equity, but allows you to specify sort of the targeted goals for your kids. So where this can play out, I think the best example is when I have families where one of their kids has Duchenne or Becker, and then they have a younger sibling that doesn't, and the kid with Duchenne or Becker, because they're like reactive and they don't have great distress tolerance, like easily ignore their sibling or like push them over, or like do things that are a little aggressive. And then all of a sudden this kid's 2 and they're kicking their 6-year-old brother's ass, and we're like, oh, okay, well, we got to train you not to do that because you could hurt your brother, because they're not stable on their feet. And so as the 2-year-old now ages, what we can do is incentivize them to disengage, right? So we incentivize our kid with dystrophy one way, and we incentivize our other kid another way, because they need to do that differently. Okay, we need to train our siblings not to engage because they could harm our boys and our manifesting girl carriers, although they do this less. And we need to train our boys and manifesting girls a little differently because they need to learn to regulate better, right? So it allows you to use the same system and be fair as possible. Actually, I don't like the F word, I don't like fair. Lets you be as equitable as possible, as just as possible, but also start to shape and modify and change the things you need to change within your home. So in the context of COVID, there's been a huge change in routine and what is normal for these kids, and they don't handle my routine. So some of you might notice your kids are like, can't handle it if you're like they thought you were going to the bank and then the gas station and then home, and you went to the gas station and then the bank and then home, right? And now they're like, well, that's not the plan, or something even smaller than that. So a huge change in routine and what is normal is likely impacting many of them, as it is us, in many ways. The fact that much of the pandemic has been characterized by unknowns and sensationalized media and the spread of misinformation has been super unhelpful. A lot of our kids are very concrete and literal, and once they get an idea in their head or a belief in their head or an understanding in their head, it can be very hard for us to change that or modify that, harder than other kids or people. And so I have had a lot of my older adolescents in particular who have consumed some stuff that was really not helpful, and we've really been trying to unpack that and undo that, because they can get very fixated and focused on things that aren't necessarily, are super unhelpful. And so you have this sort of cumulative impact of societal and mass distress, right? That is hard on any of us, but then when you're a young person or a kid where the world already feels loud and chaotic, and in your brain you're already like on high alert, right? Like this is just going to make that much louder. And then there's no real trusted roadmap for them, right? Or for you all on making sense of this novel experience, right? And these kids often need that. They're like, well, is it like that? Is it like this? And so when you don't have that already contacted life experience that they can be like, oh, okay, right? Like sometimes that could be easier for them to make sense of experiences. And so I think a lot of them have really struggled with just the concept and the abstract notions around a pandemic in general, and just how that plays out. And to comfort oneself in these experiences requires abstracting, right? So being able to separate parts from the whole and being able to look at that as individuals, but then also together. And then also acceptance of and willingness to sit with discomfort, right? Neither of which great strengths for our kids at baseline, okay? They don't have great abstracting skills, right? Because they're a little bit delayed often. Some of our kids have great abstracting skills, right? So, don't listen to me all the time, but a lot of them struggle with that. And when you don't get something and we're trying to tell you, I promise you'll feel better if we sit with this, that's a really hard sell, right? And so just a tall ask for some of these kind of acclimate and adjust quickly to context. Interesting, what I am seeing, some kiddos are actually thriving in the context of remote learning. So a lot of my kids who are my more overwhelmed kids, my kids who are kind of fit into these neat little bucket, my ones that I see, and I'm like, oh, yep, this is totally Duchenne hyperarousal. Like we're coming up with treatments. We have some medication things that have been working really well for a lot of our kids, et cetera. Let's start there. great. They're doing really well at home, right? Like they're learning better. They're having less behavior issues. They're calmer. Families are like, no, we're in a rhythm. Like we still have our moments, like they still have Duchenne, they still have meltdowns at times, but they're way less. They're way more manageable. We can kind of do this. And that just shows like the power of just how stimulating school is and the effect that has on them as humans. And so if you're the type of family that you're like, my kid does really well at school, they actually don't have behavior problems, but then they come home and like lose it, right? Like they're done. They have put all their effort into keeping it together at school and they don't have that anymore. And so there are kids who are doing, to be honest, more of my kids are doing better in remote learning than they were doing prior to the pandemic. Now that they're adjusted, they're actually doing quite well. So I'm actually very nervous about how we're going to transition back to school. And I do think that hopefully remote learning is a really good option for some of our kids that just really, really do not do well in the stimulating environment of the school system. However, some are displaying increased illness, anxiety, and OCD-like behaviors around cleanliness, right? These are my kids that tend to be more adolescent. They tend to be much more anxious at baseline. They tend to be kind of those like perseverative worry kids. And they're a little bit more anxious. However, they're still doing better in remote learning, right? So they're still doing better in school. They're just nervous about it and they don't want to go anywhere, which is actually probably not a bad idea. So that's a fair way to feel. And I'm a big fan of not pathologizing normative responses. So when you have Duchenne, it's a normative response to be like, I am a little nervous to be in public and potentially get something that could be really bad for me, right? Like that is actually a good response. We don't want you to like be so afraid that you don't engage with your family that you live with. That's a problem. You know, so balance. So some of them are actually tolerating the social isolation really well. So again, figuring out getting back to school. But others are having some mood issues in context, not being able to see their friends or their grandparents or, you know, some of their other normal people they would see as part of their day-to-day. Like that's just what they expect. However, a lot of the kids are having opportunities to socialize in ways they wouldn't otherwise. So there's a lot more groups opening. There's, you know, game nights through PPND and through Cure Duchenne, these things that are, you know, bringing kids together in ways that we just wouldn't see. And I have a lot of kids who now have friends like all over the world because they're all in lockdown and, you know, they feel social, right? And then because now everybody's in the same position they're in, like they can't go play basketball either. We're all playing video games. And I've had kids tell me that, like, I like it because I'm, you know, usually left out, but now everyone's doing the things I can do, right? And so I think in some ways there's some we've seen some really good positives from this too, and maybe ways that help our kids feel like more part of a community that they can thrive in, right? Because a lot of our kids are big technology fans, which power to them, and I strongly encourage that. And at the end of the day, the best predictor of child coping is always parental coping, right? And the easiest way to kind of understand that is you think about the time when your kids were young and they were playing and they fell down and they start crying. If you're like, oh, bud, you're okay. They're like, oh, okay, I'm fine. But if you're like, oh my gosh, you're okay. They're like crying and like losing their mind. It's not any different. They're not any less hurt, right? But you're a barometer. So if you're freaking out, they're like, oh, something's bad, right? But if you're calm, they're like, oh, I guess I'm okay, right? And so modeling and adaptive coping and managing yourself is incredibly important. And I have worked with y'all, worked with parents of these kids for several years now. And the one thing I've learned is, and the reason why I love this population, I love working with you, is because you guys are probably the most devoted parent population I've ever worked with in any diseases. Like I could tell y'all, I'd be like, yeah, you got to touch your nose like 10 times, do 3 spins, do a backflip, blah, blah. And you would be like, yeah, we did it. I learned gymnastics. We could do this thing, because you do all the things that you're told to do for your kids. And so at your own expense. And I think there are times that because these kids are a lot behaviorally, they're a lot emotionally, they're a lot from an academic learning standpoint, and they're a lot from a care demand standpoint. And very few of you do as well as I would like from a self-care standpoint, but you only have so much time in a day, right? And you can only do so much for yourself. But there's a reason why you got to put your own oxygen mask on first in an airplane, right? Because you're no good to anybody. If you're alive, you can't help other people. And so there are times that it's okay to prioritize yourself and let yourself take breaks and to do things that are good for yourself.
Do you know what, Natalie? The amount of professionals and international experts that we've had on these webinars who have said exactly the same thing, you'd have thought by now that our parents would start taking some note, wouldn't you, really?
It's easier
I'm
said than done.
pointing everybody on. It is really hard. It is,
Yeah. And I think, there's only so, and I think, a lot of parents are single parents. And I think you guys live your kid, like you live for your kids. Right. I think it's a hard thing to stop, to be like, I'm going to prioritize something for me when I haven't prioritized something for me in 10 years. Like, that's a hard thing to get used to doing. You actually can feel pretty guilty about it and bad about it. Right. And that's a different skill set you have to work on. Like, I'm being a good parent by doing this. Right. You have to combat those thoughts, because you can get in this trap of just go, 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 do. Right. And then when you don't do that, you can feel guilty about it. Right. And that's a hard thing. That's a hard thing to develop. But it is important to model adaptive coping, even when you're distressed yourself. So talking about fears, talking about anxiety, a lot of parents think, well, I don't want to like make my kids anxious. I don't want to worry them. But this is how kids can learn observationally, right? We normalize difficult moments. We normalize internal processes that are challenging, and we model adaptive coping. So even things like, you're not talking to your kid. You could be talking to your spouse. You could just be talking out loud to anybody on the phone. I have parents make this up all the time, like pretend to call somebody and have a conversation just so your kid can hear it. And it could just be like, I was so stressed today. I noticed this and I had to do this and I do this and I do this. And we're just doing that because we're highlighting like normal. And so we want them to know everybody experiences stress and anxiety. Everybody manages it differently. And then you can start to have those conversations of like, well, what do you think I would do to manage that? What have you heard me say I do to manage things, right? Because they really, I love these kids. They're so, so good at getting help for things that they can do, particularly as they age. They'll be like, oh, I don't know, can you help me with that? And I'm like, you are capable of doing this, and you don't want to do the cognitive work to do it, but you are a very smart kid. And so sometimes it is important to push them, because they do have to put more effort into these things. It's not as easy for them to do these things as it is for their kids, because of how their brains function. And so when they're saying this is harder for me, it is. I do think it is. Doesn't mean they can't do it. Just means it's harder for them. And you want to intentionally create opportunities for them to observe you cope, right? And they don't have to be genuine opportunities, right? Like, you can come home or just have a moment where you're like, I'm really stressed. I'm going to go take 5 minutes and by myself. I'm going to take a couple minutes and I'm going to drink some tea. I'm going to go for a walk, right? And you're teaching, it's okay to take some space. It's okay to do something for yourself to calm down. It's okay to, disengage, right? Because we want them to start to do these things as well. Get real comfortable using planned ignoring, okay? And it's okay to tell your kid, like, I've already answered that, I'm not answering that again, right? Or like, hey, you're being a lot right now, I'm gonna ignore you for a couple hours. It's okay, like, that's okay. Like, that might be annoying. Put some noise canceling headphones on, some earplugs in. You could tell them, I'm putting earplugs in. There's a lot of different ways to manage that, but get comfortable with it, because it will be something for these boys that's needed in order to address some other things, which I'm about to talk about here in a minute. You want to focus on shaping as much desired behavior. So the behaviors you want to keep seeing, you want to focus on optimizing those, because these kids tend to get a lot of, they're always hearing or, getting attention for things they can't do. And not always, not maliciously, right? Like, they tend to get the most attention because they need help walking, and they need help doing this, and they need help doing this, and they need help doing this. And, and so the attention they get is always in this context of like, I'm not good at this, or I'm not good at walking. I'm not, and they're always that sense of like less than. And so we want to really focus on all the things that they're good at. And we want to do that even more so than we normally would. Want to catch them being good as often as possible, because we want them to see themselves as highly capable. We want them to know that they have all these strengths, and where they tend to get the most attention is in needs. Okay. And so then, they develop a behavioral pattern that tends to be needy. Right. And the problem with this is, as these kids are getting their most independence, is when they start to need the most dependent help. And that's, a mismatch, and that's relatively unique to this population. And so working to really catch them good can really help them develop a narrative young and as they develop, in recognizing like, I need help with these things, but I have, I'm really good at these things. And they don't always have to be like outcome specific. Like, I'm good at getting good grades. I'm good at doing video games. But sometimes it's like, I'm good at calming down. I'm good at recognizing my mom's upset. I'm good at being kind to my sister when she's in a bad mood. I'm good at feeding the dog, right? It's those other little things that sometimes we don't pay attention to, that you wouldn't maybe normally have to pay as much attention to or highlight as much, but for these boys can be really, really, really powerful. You want to do all you can to intentionally promote resilience, because these boys are tough in a lot of ways that they don't even realize. Like things like, I'm like, you gotta be real bothered by this. And they're not. They're like, oh, I didn't really think about it like that. You know, they're not bothered. They're like pretty tough guys. Like, and our girls too, like they're just living life. Like they're just not as bothered as like, I feel like I would be if in many situations. And so we always want to focus on like, we can't predict the future, and they can get a little stuck about what's going to happen in the future. So we want to focus on, you know, we can't predict the future, but what we can plan for is how we are going to respond when something unexpected happens. Okay. And that's where that creating rituals and routines and that kind of habits kind of develop, so that, you know, when something unexpected happens, like they know exactly what they can do to help themselves calm down. So you develop a plan around that, right? Like I do this, I do this, I do this. So sometimes it's like, if your kid has a hard time transitioning from the car into the home or something like that, you know, before you leave the car, it could be something like, hey, so we're gonna go inside. What do you think you're gonna feel, right? What are you gonna wanna do? Okay, what can mommy do to help you? What can daddy do? What are you gonna do? Okay, what are we gonna do if this happens? And so they're thinking about it and they're planning, versus just kind of functioning on automatic behavior and then all of a sudden having this experience and now it's a meltdown. Positive self-talk is kind of hard for these kids, again, I think because of how attentional loops tend to work for them. And so sometimes just even really specific, like what are the things you can say to yourself in your head, right? Like what can we say to ourselves? Like how can we focus on this? Can be really helpful, because they do struggle with that language development piece. And sometimes even just having that really specific sort of set of rehearsed responses can be really helpful, because it also, when you're repeating to yourself in your head, you can't think super anxious thoughts and do that simultaneously. You just can't do both. So it can also kind of help interrupt some of that more anxious thinking loops that they can get into. Okay, this is important. You want to work on fighting the urge to give into checking in and reassurance seeking. Okay, so if your kid is the type of kid that does a lot of reassurance seeking around things like, when are we going to grandma's? And you're like, we're going to grandma's next Tuesday. And then for a week, every 10 minutes, they're asking when you're going to grandma's, right? If you telling them that they were going to grandma's next Tuesday, every time help them feel better, they will quit asking, right? But that's not the issue. It's not that they actually don't remember when they're going to grandma's, right? It's that they're not trusting and confident and comfortable with telling themselves that they know when they're going to grandma's. And so when they're, you know, escalating, anytime any of us, right, like we reassurance seek, what we're doing is we're training our body to not tolerate that physiological feeling, and it makes it worse. And so the more that we check and reassurance seek and do these things, the less tolerance we have over those things. So it makes things worse. So if you're somebody that checks your doors a lot, or windows, or you ever have before you leave the house, and you've been able to stop that, what you'll notice is it's basically preventing yourself from doing that thing. And the more you do that, the less you want to do it. Does that make sense? So we can provide reassurance to a degree, and then we tell them we're no longer providing reassurance, right? So we say things like, okay, what did I tell you? When did I tell you we were going to grandma's? And they'll tell you out loud, Tuesday. Okay, yep, you're right. And I'm not answering that question. And they ask you, when you're going to grandma's, what did I tell you? Right? Because they know. And the more you tell them and comfort them, right, you're training them not to trust that they know what they know, and that they need you to tell them they know it so they feel okay. So schedule breaks and take them for yourselves. Take unplanned breaks if you need to. If you are a type of parent that is easily aroused, like I am, or I'm hyper, like I would, I'd be like, okay, I have to step away because I am making this worse, probably a lot. It's okay. Like take breaks from media consumption. Now is a good time, well, over the last year, really, to be a hawk about what your kids are consuming, because we don't want to kind of develop false beliefs or harmful beliefs that are going to be really hard for us to undo or readdress in some ways. get outside when you can. Being outside is helpful. I know not weather right now, but as it gets warmer, even things like sitting outside on the porch if you have a porch, or opening the windows and just, you know, letting the air hit you. Sunshine is helpful on us. They're natural reinforcers. Even if you're nonverbal and you can't move, getting outside has a robust effect on helping people qualitatively feel better. And we can see that in reduced pain meds and reduced needs for agitation medications and those things. Resiliency is shaped through experience. And so how you cope during this time and how you parent and how you engage your kids and live life is going to largely influence how they remember this time, how they see themselves in the context of big events like a pandemic, and how they incorporate and understand the gravity, right? And so we always want to teach our kids, like, things can be serious and we can talk to you about things and we can talk about the news. And then we have to make a choice, right? We have to make a choice to live life. We have to make a choice to be happy. We have to make a choice to focus on things that aren't just anxiety producing, right? Because there's always gonna be things to be afraid of, and there's always gonna be things that we should be worried about. But we don't want to only live there, because that's not healthy. And we want to teach that adaptive coping, right? Like, you want to be aware, right? But you don't want to just live in that space. And by making things fun and doing those things, that's a really good way to kind of incorporate that sort of into this time right now. Just because I'd like to think we're going to be out of this soon, but I'm not that confident about it. Kindness and gratitude exercises can be huge at this point in time, because a lot of parents I work with are hard on themselves in a lot of ways. And their kids are hard on themselves just around, you know, like, we're only doing 3 hours of school and we used to do 8 hours of school, and, you know, I just can't, you know, do this. And we're, you know, and everyone has a limit, and you're probably still working, and you probably have more than one kid, and you can only do what you can do, and your kids can only do what they can do. You're probably doing a great job, and they're probably doing a great job. And so it's okay to be kind to yourself, and you should go out of your way and always say, like, if I had a friend who treated me like this, would I be okay with that? Right? If I had, you know, would I talk to a friend like this? Like, if I had a friend who came to me and was like, I have somebody in my life talk to me like this, wouldn't you tell them to get out of that? But, like, we allow ourselves to talk to ourselves like that, right? So, like, be a friend to yourself sometimes and be like, what would my friend say right now? Because I'm not being very friendly to me. And gratitude. So sometimes even, you know, exercises that can help our kids get outside of themselves, right? Because sometimes we can get really focused on, like, how this is impacting me. And some ways that might buffer that are, you know, making cards for the elderly and telling them that you're thinking about them, or things like that, that just kind of push you outside yourself a bit and help you kind of just contact your values and feel good in a way that isn't related to doing a breathing treatment, or putting your AFOs on, or, you know, passing a PFT or whatever, right? So some of these things that we do, we just don't necessarily always do intentionally. Taking a little bit more effort to do them intentionally right now can be meaningful and can help kind of buffer some of the secondary impact of, you know, prolonged isolation and lack of positive peer support, and a risk of a pandemic potentially when you have a pulmonary cardiac disease. So transitioning out of isolation. Okay. I am a little worried about how this is going to go for a lot of our kids. I think that there are some kids that will be okay. I think that a lot of our kids are really going to struggle with transitioning back into the school for many reasons. One, the schools are overwhelming, but also one thing to transition to home, quiet, predictable, all your stuff, blah, blah, blah. Another thing to transition after a year into chaos. So I think that'll be a challenge. I would probably, so I've never done this before, so we're working hypothetical land at this point. But what I'm encouraging my families here in Columbus to do is kind of start to proactively plan for that, right? So, you know, starting to talk about how situation's temporary and we're going back to school, when we go back to school, when we go back to the classroom, when we're doing this, when we're this, and kind of like, how does that feel like when we're talking about that? Well, let's get ready for that. Like, what do you think? And you're just kind of coaching them through, even if it doesn't happen for another year, right? We just want them to always be thinking about that and knowing that that's going to happen, right? And so hopefully most of you have I've never met a parent of a kid with Becker Duchenne or dystrophy that doesn't know their kid incredibly well. But you'll pick up on that and you'll start to notice, like, oh, I think, you know, I'm noticing this, your response is this way. And you will naturally start to have ideas about how your kid best needs to transition back. And then you can kind of reach out to the school and kind of come up with a plan. I do think some of our kids are going to need a gradual return plan. I have kids here. We're going to do a gradual return plan just so it's successful, right? Because we don't want to overflood them. We don't overwhelm them. I'd rather be a successful return instead of a flooding. Now we've like trained you to like be like super scared of school, because the first couple of times you went back, it was terrifying. And so we want to be thoughtful of that, just knowing kind of how their brains function and how they learn and how concrete and literal they can often be. And so that's where I'm going to leave the transitional isolation, because my hope is we can talk about that further based on more specific and unique experiences that you all may be having, or what you think, like my kid's kind of like this, and maybe we can kind of start to tackle that during my next time with you guys.
There's been some fabulous questions coming through actually, generally, and actually one of the points that one of the parents made was connecting to habits. She's finding that it keeps reminding her about changes and not part of the daily routine, that he's much more receptive to that change in routine.
Hey, Lynette, you were frozen. I couldn't hear the whole beginning of that.
Carry on, my line was terrible. It was we were talking about changes. I was talking about yeah, so one of our mums has put in that she can really connect to the point about creating rituals and habits, and actually this relates obviously to coming out of lockdown as well. She finds that if she keeps reminding her 5-year-old about any changes that are not part of their daily routine, then he's much more receptive to that change in routine over time.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. Kind of that predicting and expectation kind of management, right? So it doesn't catch them off guard, right? Like that's beautiful. I'm impressed you're able to do that like continuously. That can be kind of a hard thing to remember to do.
And I think someone also said, which is quite interesting, that sometimes their routine, so their rituals and habits, isn't suitable for other siblings, or doesn't kind of match in with family activities. I know a number of families on this call today and have got a number of children that are differing ages, differing interests, differing stages, and it is hard.
Yeah, for those types of situations, we're working in what's the best we can do, and sometimes it's like we maybe schedule some of our kids' days one way, so hey, like you kind of need a very specific schedule, so we're gonna schedule this here. Our siblings have this, and what you do during these times are X, Y, and Z, right? So because we want to be fair between our kids, but having other kids and multiple things that you're managing definitely makes these recommendations that I'm making incredibly challenging when you have kids with different abilities and some that have different needs. So sometimes it's even developing those like layered, right? So simultaneously, which can be challenging. But that is a really good point, and definitely something that is hard to manage no matter what. I wish I had like some magic strategies I could say like do this and it'll work for all your kids, but unfortunately I just don't know those yet. And having multiple kids is really challenging with this population. I will be the first one to do
that. The same mom actually, it's quite nice. This is what I love about these sessions, is that people often end up having a chat in the chat about experiences that they're having, and Tambi's actually said that she's struggled with the different age groups, and that when her son's routine is not suitable for her 2.5-year-old daughter when she needs a nap, so she sits him down and explains that it's important for her to have the nap and they can do something fun later, and actually also getting responding with an affirmative, so that the child or the young person has actually responded with a yes. So holding them, touching them on the shoulder and saying, yes, can you hear me, is that okay? I know I've heard that from other parents as well.
You're breaking up a lot, Lynette, and I really didn't catch that.
Don't worry, you guys carry on. I'll put myself on mute.
Can you hear me, Natalie?
Yes.
Yes, I was just so what Lynette was saying, that another parent was saying that when her child's routine was not suitable for other family activities or other siblings, I find that I've explained it to my 5-year-old son. When his routine is not suitable for his 2.5-year-old sister who needs a nap, I sit him down and explain it to him that, listen, Subir, your sister really needs a nap, otherwise she'll be a grumpy cow later in the afternoon, and you don't want that, do you? So he understands, and if I make sure that he understands that, and that if I offer him something in return, like a fun activity or a TV show for 15 minutes, then he's much more receptive to that.
That's a beautiful way to handle it. Kind of pairing something, if their routine is less ideal to them, like they have to tolerate a slowing down so their sibling can nap, like having that maybe be, okay, you're going to tolerate this change, so we're going to let you do something really fun, or something like play your video game or something. That's a great way to handle that, kind of, so that, it's not horrible for them too. And they're, kind of like, okay, well, I guess we'll tolerate this thing. Like, that's a beautiful way to handle that.
Yeah, because
he understands the rationale behind a nap. That's great.
Yeah, because he loves to paint, and when his sister is in the background, she will mess up everything and she won't let him paint. So I always use that as an incentive and say, listen, she's napping, this is your time to paint on your own, would you like that? And he's like, yeah, let's go for it. So just, you have to find what works for your child, and you have to find the triggers that they know that they'll be happy with.
Yes, I love that.
I think what we'll do now is we're having a little bit of technical difficulties today. If anybody does have any questions, please feel free to take yourselves off of mute and ask your questions to Natalie.
Hi. Thank you, Natalie, for all your words. I just think, man, I wish you could just come in and hang out at our house for a little bit. But you talked about incorporating breaks in the day to help alleviate some of those triggers of getting up higher and higher. I'm wondering about if I'm implementing those breaks, then him having difficulty getting back to what we were supposed to be doing. Does that make sense? So he does have a problem with transition. So if I'm implementing these breaks, but then we're also having to combat the transitions back into his regular scheduled program. What would you speak to that?
So it's a hard question for me to answer without having some other information. I'm pretty interested in how your schedule's structured. So usually when I hear things like that, I want to know the structure of a schedule, see if there's a way that we could optimize or sort of structure things in a way that there's a buffer transition, right? So we're transitioning to something that's less hard for them to transition to, and then we can kind of transition into something else. Or we structure so it's we have to get these things done, boom, 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 right? So that way, if we have our break and we don't transition great, we have a buffer window. We're not going back into math or something where we really don't have a lot of time to kind of to play with that. And so usually in those situations, I find redoing the schedule in a way that kind of buffers that a little bit better can be helpful, and or make it part of the incentive program that you put those things early, so it's boom, 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 and then you have to transition, and you earn the most points for transitioning back into this thing you don't want to do, and that's the only way that you're going to unlock your tablet time later in the afternoon, right? And if you don't earn it, you don't transition, so be it, you're going to be bored all afternoon, my man. Right. So that's where those incentives come in for those harder things where it's I know you don't want to do this, but we can't just only do things we want. The world would be terrifying. So you got to put a lot of effort into doing this thing that you don't want to do that's hard for you. Right. So then we incentivize it, right? We make it a big deal. That's how you earn this one thing you want every day, right? Is just by going back into this thing if you need to. And you do that a bit, and then you can shape it back and shift that power into something else often for these kids. Because once they learn it and they do it, and then they're in a rhythm, you don't really have to do that anymore because they're pretty regimen. And they're like, well, I always transition back, and now they're just doing it. You don't have to really reward it. That's where this comes in as a positive for them, right? Is like, they'll just keep doing stuff because they just always have done it, right? So if you can get them doing it, then you can kind of stop the incentive and you can move it on to something else. Does that make sense? Easier said than done. Everything I say, I'll tell you right now, I'm going to talk about it like it's a lot easier than it is. So I'm not trying to minimize the challenge here.
Natalie, we've had a question come in. What is the upper age range of the children you study, and how do these guidelines vary as a child reaches teenage years?
I see everybody. So the youngest kids I see are like 2, and I have some men with Beckers that are in their 60s that I see. So I see the whole lifespan. I see a lot of these kids tolerate. This is a tough question for me to answer because a lot of it's hypothetical. So in some ways, what I think happens, so I do think that a lot of our boys calm. Why that is, I think, is multifaceted. I think you just can't, as they're losing, functional mobility, right? Like they're just not as physically reactive. They can't be, right? You're not going to see the behavioral dysregulation overtly as you would. So we do tend to see like more mood concerns or more that sort of like anxious, like worry type stuff kind of can happen more in adolescence. But some kids actually, even in their 20s, kind of like just do better. And I do think there's some of these kids that are so heightened that maybe don't present as overly anxious, but we're more behaviorally dysregulated. They have a harder time transitioning into using a power wheelchair and these things because they are just such active kids that they kind of, the system in like people that have chronic hyperarousal, you actually can deplete that system. And so you actually like, you don't have those swings anymore. You just kind of are neutral. And a lot of, I work with a lot of men in their 20s, late 20s, and they're kind of just like neutral all the time. And, and they'll tell you like, oh, I'm not really bothered by that, but they don't get excited. They're just kind of like, yeah, it's fine. Right. And, when you live this kind of height and you kind of get, you deplete that system. And so I do worry about that sometimes for our adolescents, sometimes when they're really just like okay with everything. Is that genuine, or is that related because like they're just they don't have the whole spectrum of maybe physiological emotion arousal that they used to have? I'm not sure. The psychiatrists that I work with closely and we talk about this kind of stuff all the time. But we do see more of a adjustment, anxiety, presentation as the boys age. A little bit less of this rage-like meltdown, chaotic presentation.
Thanks, Natalie. There's another question from another mom who says that her child is on medication for ADHD, but it's not really working. So from what all you said at that point in time, would you suggest it's not worth taking?
What medication is it?
Jacqueline, do you want to answer that question, darling?
Yeah, I can actually. Sorry, I'm just sort of clicking on a few things. Yeah, he's it's like a lizardexamine something. I can't remember now. It's called lizardexamfetamine. It's for ADHD. Sorry?
It's a stimulant?
I don't really know. I think it's probably an anti-stimulant because obviously it's for hyperactivity. And he's been recently diagnosed with ADHD, which to me everybody says it's quite obvious that he's got ADHD, but by what you're saying, I don't really think he has got ADHD. I think he's got Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and he's got all the traits of that. Obviously he's autistic as well. What you were saying about all your other children, I do think that my son's quite extreme. He definitely is autistic as well as he hasn't just got a few learning difficulties kind of thing. So maybe he has got ADHD as well, and then monitoring it, that he may well go up the the levels,
Yeah,
so it will help. But I don't, by what you said, I kind of feel like I'm flogging a dead horse in a way. Is it worth doing it?
There are some kids, so stimulants are the primary treatment for ADHD. Actually, there are some non-stimulant classes of medications. So that's tough. I mean, if it's not working, that's your call. I'm not a physician, so I'm not going to tell you what meds or anything like that. We take a different approach in our house, so I think we have a better effect for kind of working on some of that hyperactivity, or that, like, if they're trying to do that to kind of help him calm, like, we have found other things are tending to work better.
Right.
Things that target hyperarousal, things that target physiologically instead of frontal lobe function, not trying to speed that up, which is what those meds do, but kind of shut things down, regulate the brain, tends to work a little bit better, and slowing them down and that kind of stuff. And so I actually don't know.
Is that just by doing what you're sort of saying? Because I'm sort of taking a few notes here, because I thought it was really good there, by the way. But yeah, I mean, do you mean just by doing these kind of strategies?
No, your kid probably is a kid that probably does need something if they have very extreme behaviors. And my kids that are kind of present, like it sounds like your kid does, it's hard for these things to work if they're not optimize on some medication to kind of slow them down and let things work, right? Because then you're just in this space where you're like, oh man, we're trying to put demands on our kid, and like they're not optimized. Like now they're like hurting themselves because they're just like losing it. And so I actually, like, until we started to figure out sleep, and until we have them to a place that like parents are like, okay, yeah, I think we took the edge off. A lot of times I won't start super intense behavioral treatment for kids like your son. So I would probably encourage you. I don't know how it works in the UK. Like what I've been having when I do talks like this here in the States, what I've been having people do is just like email me, and then we can kind of like consult to your primary team and be like, this is what we're doing kind of, and like kind of provide that guidance. I don't know how that works, but I'm happy to try to do that, or at least maybe back channel. I can give you some recommend or kind of let you know what medication classes we're using, and then you can take that back to your team. And at least
that'd be great. Yeah, thanks.
So I'm happy if you want to email me, and I can kind of just tell you some of the things that we're doing here. Not that I'm telling you what to do, because I'm not a physician, but at least
no, that's fine.
Just thinking about it.
I mean, it's all just advice, isn't it? And whether it works or not, kind of thing. But I mean, all the stuff you were saying, you know, he does need to. He goes to school like 4 days a week. He does definitely need that break in the week and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But so it was really, really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. No, those kinds of kids are hard because they're just hard because they got a lot going on.
Yeah, he is. He's lovely, but he's hard.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks, Natalie. Natalie, the next question is from Cheryl, another mom who was also talking about the breaks at school, and she wants to know how the breaks can be implemented at school without your child feeling singled out or different.
Yeah, that's a good question. So once you kind of get a good idea at home, take a similar like that. So it's like they need 1 break a day, do 1 break a day at school at the same time, kind of, or you know, they might need 2 breaks or. But usually what I do is I work with schools to kind of think through their schedule in a way that buffers that. So some of their more academic classes always kind of need to be in the morning because most of these kids cognitively fatigue like they do muscle fatigue. And so we want to optimize that early morning ability to learn. And so if they need a break, you know, after 2 hours, I might put like a class there that they could break in, right? So maybe that is where they go to like their English class or something like that. And in English, they can go read a book in the back, right? And just take a minute. And you can, or maybe they go and do like their speech, or they do it during OT. A lot of OTs are really on board to help from a sensory standpoint of like doing different things that are calming, but then also working on some of those OT goals. And so I often, the little kids actually don't have too much problem feeling stigmatized doing their breaks, but our older kids do. And so usually what I try to do for the older kids is try to pair that with a class or like a scheduling thing so that they're not being taken out of class for a break or anything like that, or going to a class late because they had a break. So sometimes we do it like transition into lunchtime, right? Or in those special classes or something like that is usually where I would do that. Some kids, if they're capable of self-regulating, and some of the kids is they can actually like do this during class, right? Like they can shut their bodies down and work on calming themselves. It's just usually a lot easier for them to do it outside of the class.
Right, thank you. Does that answer your question, Cheryl? I think we've lost Cheryl. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Paul wants to know, Natalie, what is the upper age range of children you study, and how do these guidelines vary as a child reaches their teenage years?
I think I talked about that. Do you want me to talk about it again?
So if you could just quickly recap
Oh,
for
sure.
Paul's benefit.
So I see the youngest kid I see is they're around 2. The oldest person I see has Becker's, and he's 65. So I see across the whole lifespan. I've seen quite a range. The guidelines change. I do see less sort of behavioral dysregulation and rage like meltdowns and those like sort of overt topography things that are really loud. As they age, usually I start to see less of that, like 12, 13. I think there's that part of that is because they're less able to display those things, right? Because of functional mobility decline. But I do think that their brains mature and catch up, and I do think they're better able to tolerate some of these things. But I also think the systems get depleted, and so I don't think that they get aroused because over time you kind of ruin that system if it's on all the time. So I think it's multifaceted in some ways. And I think what we start to see is a little bit more cognitive anxiety, adjustment, and mood stuff related to the aging aspects of Duchenne, right? Like everyone's driving and I'm not driving. I want to go to college, but I don't want to go out of state, but I want to be with my friends, but I can't be with my friends. Like I have a lot of my college age men that are in school have struggled because all their friends have got to move back to campus and they're doing classes together and they haven't been able to move back in with them. And so they kind of feel excluded and left out. So it's a lot more like life stuff related, like more traditional life stuff we would expect from in psychology. So adjustment to, feeling different and having, a life limiting illness is more where I see that kind of where my work is after about 12, 13. And under that, I'm usually working in much more of this behavioral chaos sort of space.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Lynette here. I've dialed in by phone, so hopefully you can hear me a bit clearer. The wonders of technology. We're going to wrap up for this evening. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're really sorry about the technical issues. I guess that's the problem with working from home and being on the home Wi-Fi, etc. But thank you to our volunteer Tanvi for stepping in and asking the questions. And Natalie, thank you so much for giving us your time. It's absolutely fascinating. And I'll be sharing the recording with you guys shortly. So thank you. And hopefully we'll see you all on the 5th.
Yeah, and if any of you if you think of things, if you send them in and I can think about them and I can come prepared to kind of talk about more specific things related to you and your population, your community, I'm happy to do that.
Fantastic. You should all have, thank you. And you should all have our email addresses and we've got quite a lot of questions that have been kind of obviously recorded from today, which will we'll probably go back to the parents who asked the questions and see if there's anything else you'd like to add, if that's okay. But yeah, thank you all.
Thanks.